I work the night shift at the Cannibal's market. There are strange rules to follow. I don't like talking about my life. Even when people ask, I usually brush it off with vague phrases or jokes so I don't seem pathetic. But if you're reading this, then I no longer have to worry about my reputation. If you ever get offered a job as a night cashier at Hunter's Market on the outskirts of Ashwood, Oregon, don't take it. Just run. I'm 25. Life didn't work out. Dropped out of college, drowning in debt, stuck in low-paying gigs. That's how I ended up in a rundown motel at the edge of town, where something scratched behind the wall every night. The faded neon sign above the entrance once promised comfort and coziness, but now it flickered mockingly. I was sitting on my bed, staring at the peeling walls, when I noticed a pamphlet on the nightstand. Bold red letters stood out against the white background: night cashier at Hunter's Market. Pay, $150 per shift. $150 a night? It seemed too good to be true. But I had no choice. I needed money fast. The store was off the main road. The last street lamp disappeared behind me as I moved down the dark path through the fog. Hunter's Market looked old-fashioned, dimly lit windows, a worn wooden sign, and a door battered by time. A gas station stood nearby, but it was closed. In the distance, I could barely make out the silhouette of my motel, the only familiar landmark. The door opened almost silently. Inside, the air was damp, carrying a faint metallic scent. The floor creaked beneath my feet. The shelves were stocked with the usual convenience store goods: canned food, snacks, cheap alcohol. Behind the counter stood a man. Tall, gaunt, with a sharp, hollow face lined with deep wrinkles. His bald head gleamed under the cold fluorescent lights. He didn't move until I stepped closer.
You here for the job?
His voice was low, almost emotionless. I nodded.
Name?
Ethan. Ethan Carter. The man didn't ask about my experience. He didn't care why I wanted the job.
Harold Grayson, owner.
Grayson silently walked past me, motioning for me to follow. We moved through a narrow hallway until we reached a thick metal door. He pulled out a ring of keys, fumbled through them for a while, and finally unlocked it. The door opened with a barely audible creak, and a cold draft hit my face. Inside, several large industrial freezers stood against the walls, their surfaces rusted and stained with dark patches. The smell. I couldn't pinpoint its source, but something about it made my skin crawl. A mix of raw meat and metal lingered in the air.
This is where we keep the stock.
Grayson said flatly, gesturing to the freezers.
When customers place an order, you take the package with the matching number.
He handed me a yellowed sheet of paper. Under the dim storage light, I struggled to make out the list of rules, printed in faded ink. Lock the door after midnight. Only open for those who knock in the specific pattern. Knock, 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 knock. Do not open the black packages. Always fulfill customer requests. Do not ask unnecessary questions. Do not count the money, customers know the price. If a customer has no pupils, stay silent, follow their instructions, and give them their order. A cold sweat broke out across my skin. Something about this list felt so absurd that I couldn't react immediately. Is this a joke? My voice trembled slightly. Grayson didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the front door and knocked the rhythm. He paused, looking at me as if making sure I memorized it, then nodded.
Remember, if you open the door for the wrong person, you'll be the one with problems.
I didn't know what he meant by problems, and I didn't want to ask. The cold from the storage room seeped into my bones. Grayson handed me a uniform, a simple black t-shirt with the Hunter's Market logo. Then, without another word, he turned and left through the back exit. I was alone. Behind the counter. In a store where every second, I felt more certain that something was very, very wrong. The clock read 11:58 p.m. My first night shift was just beginning. I stood behind the counter, staring at the dark screen of my phone. Time dragged unbearably slow. The store was silent, too silent. The only sound was the faint buzzing of the neon sign above the entrance. I was beginning to think the night would pass uneventfully when a knock echoed through the door. I flinched. It was too soon, only 10 minutes past midnight. I approached the door hesitantly. Something about the rhythm unsettled me. But I remembered Grayson's warning, only open for those who knocked correctly. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the door. A man stood on the threshold. Tall, gaunt, his pale skin almost translucent under the fluorescent light. His eyes were sunken, cheeks hollow, lips cracked from dryness. He stared at me silently, unblinking. Beneath his long coat, something twitched slightly, as if another pair of hands was hidden under the fabric.
Package number 14.
His voice was raspy, like he hadn't spoken in a week. I froze for a moment, but then turned and headed toward the storage room. The freezers lined the walls, and I began searching for the right number. The cold bit at my fingers as I touched the black bags with attached tags. 14, found it. The package was heavy, ice cold, covered in a thin layer of frost. I brought it to the counter and noticed the man had tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something invisible. His lips twitched in a brief, eerie spasm that almost resembled a smile. Slowly, he extended bony fingers and pulled out crumpled $100 bills. They looked worn, old, as if they had spent decades rotting in a basement. He dropped them onto the counter, then snatched the package and disappeared through the door without looking back. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at the door. Something felt off. Even the way he held the package, like he was afraid someone might take it from him. I slowly picked up the money, feeling their damp, unpleasant texture. They smelled strange, musty, like ancient books forgotten in a damp cellar. $500, a hefty sum for a purchase in such a rundown place. A chill crept up my spine, but I shoved the bills into the register and forced myself to ignore the questions swirling in my mind. The next knock came at 2:37 a.m. The same rhythm. I already knew what to do. I unlocked the door and barely suppressed a shudder. This time, it was a woman. She stood swaying slightly, her hands covered in cuts, the tips of her fingers raw, no nails, just red, crusted marks. Her clothes were filthy, as if she had crawled through thickets or dug through the earth. When she inhaled, I heard a faint hissing sound, like her lungs weren't used to air.
Package number 7.
Her voice was calm, almost emotionless. I quickly turned to the freezers. Number 7 was near the entrance. The package was much smaller than the previous one. Something shifted inside, soft, liquid, with tiny, bead-like lumps. I tried not to think about what it could be. When I placed the package on the counter, the woman stared at it intently, then reached into her pocket and carefully laid out $800 bills before me. Her hands trembled. She took the package, tucked it under her coat, and left into the night without another word. I couldn't take my eyes off the door. The cold from the freezer no longer mattered. The real chill had seeped into my bones in a different way. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I kept my eyes on the door and the small window, straining to hear every sound. Outside, the darkness was absolute, and I listened intently for any noise. No more customers came that night. When my shift ended at 6 a.m., I called the owner, but he didn't answer. I took $150 from the register on my own and left the store. The next evening, I arrived for my shift a bit earlier than required. Grayson was already gone, but a set of keys lay on the counter, keys to the front door, the storage room, and some of the freezers. I still felt uneasy after the events of the previous night. The store seemed just as quiet as before, but something had changed. I opened the storage room, and the first thing I noticed was that the freezers were nearly empty. Just yesterday, the shelves had been packed with black packages, but now only 3 remained. I had no idea what that meant. Grayson hadn't mentioned restocking, and I hadn't seen any deliveries. But judging by how quickly the stock was moving, there wouldn't be anything left by the end of my shift. I closed the storage room, carefully checked the store, and sat behind the counter. The register was stuffed with old, dirty bills, though a few newer ones were mixed in. I roughly estimated the amount over $5,000. Now it made sense why this job paid so well. The owner could clearly afford it. The clock struck midnight, and within minutes, I heard the familiar knock. I sighed, walked to the door, and unlocked it. A man in a long black coat stood outside. His face was gray, wrinkled, his eyes sunken like deep hollows. He tilted his head and spoke in a hollow voice.
Package number 1.
I nodded and headed to the storage room. I found the package with the correct tag and pulled it out. But as I lifted it, something sticky coated my fingers. Looking down, I saw dark liquid seeping from the package. Blood. A wave of nausea clenched my chest. I carefully placed the package on the counter. The man didn't move. He simply stood there, staring at it. Then, slowly, as if in a trance, he ran his tongue over his lips. His eyes darkened, and his mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. The store lights flickered. Panic surged through me. For a moment, the room was swallowed by darkness. When the lights returned, the man was gone. The package, too. In its place on the counter lay a handful of crumpled $100 bills. I gasped, my heart pounding. I had no idea what had just happened. A prank? A hallucination? Or a reality I didn't want to accept? I wanted to leave, to run, but a new knock froze me in place. Slowly, I approached the door and opened it. A small boy stood outside. He looked ordinary, except too clean, as if freshly scrubbed and dressed in new clothes. He lifted his large eyes to me and smiled.
Package number 3.
His voice was too calm, almost melodic. I nodded, trying not to think about the previous customer, and walked to the storage room. I found package number 3 and was about to bring it out when curiosity got the better of me. I looked at the package. It was small, wrapped tightly in layers of plastic. Something about it felt oddly rigid, its shape unnatural. I tore the plastic open. Inside, neatly lined up in a row, were human fingers. Dried, pale, severed with surgical precision. Like sausages in vacuum-sealed packaging. My stomach lurched. I nearly dropped the package. But at that moment, a voice echoed through the store.
Ethan returned to the customer immediately.
It wasn't the boy's voice. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. I clenched my fists, struggling to stay upright. I quickly rewrapped the package and rushed back into the store. The boy was still there, his smile now wider. He was humming a tune, something eerily familiar. I couldn't bring myself to hand him the package. But something inside me made me do it. Something stronger than fear. I placed the package on the counter. The boy grabbed it swiftly, pulled a few crumpled bills from his pocket, and left them in front of me. Then, as if nothing had happened, he skipped into the darkness, still whistling. I stood frozen, completely drained. $25. That was the price of that cursed package. The store fell silent again. But this time, it was no longer just silence. I spent the rest of my shift on edge, periodically glancing at the clock, dreading the next knock. When the clock struck 6 a.m., I didn't wait for the owner. I didn't call him. I took my pay from the register and left the store. The third night began with a sense of unease. Something in the air felt different, as if the very space of the store had shifted. I could feel it, even though I tried to convince myself it was just exhaustion. Time crawled by. There were no customers. Only one package remained in the storage room. I sat behind the counter, scrolling through my phone when something made me look up. The clock read 3:33. And then the knock came. This time, it sounded different. Distorted, muffled, like someone knocking through a thick layer of water. My heart pounded, but I knew I had to open the door. She stood on the threshold. Tall, pale, almost unreal. A woman in a long black coat, her hair cascading over her shoulders. But most of all, her eyes. There were no pupils. just milky white voids.
Package number 2.
Her voice was soft, yet it echoed inside my skull. I didn't reply. I simply turned and walked toward the storage room. I remembered the rule. No speaking. As I opened the door, a wave of cold horror washed over me. The floor was drenched in blood. Dark, almost black, glistening under the dim light. Small pools spread between the freezers, thin streams trickling down their doors. I swallowed hard and forced myself to step inside. It's just a leak, maybe frozen meat. I tried to reason, but even I didn't believe it. Box number 2 was in the largest freezer at the very back of the room. It was enormous, far bigger than any of the previous packages. Thick layers of black garbage bags wrapped around it, pulled so tight it seemed to be hiding something alive. I nudged the box forward cautiously, but it was heavy, too heavy. I pushed it through the puddles of blood, feeling the cold liquid seeping through the soles of my shoes. Finally, with one last effort, I hauled it onto the counter. The woman with no pupils remained still, her lips curving into a thin smile. She nodded slightly and placed a thick envelope in front of me. And then it started. The lights flickered. The walls, they whispered. A soft, drawn-out murmur filled the store. The words were indistinct, but I knew they were meant for me. The store felt alive. Then came the sound. Faint at first, like a twig snapping. But it grew louder, sharper. A crunch. Bones breaking inside the package. Do you like the story? Don't forget to subscribe to get more of this content. I staggered back as the woman's smile widened. She leaned toward the package, running her fingers over it, her chest rising with an excited breath. Suddenly, something moved inside. I couldn't take it anymore. In blind panic, I ducked behind the counter, curling into myself, my head pressed against my knees. My eyes squeezed shut. And then, a scream. Piercing, unbearable, inhuman. It stretched on forever, rupturing my eardrums, sending violent tremors through my body. And then, silence. I don't know how long I stayed curled up before I dared to peek over the counter. The woman was gone. The store looked normal, as if nothing had happened. Only the thick envelope of money remained on the counter. I glanced at the clock. 10 minutes left in my shift. And then I made my decision. I had to find out what was behind all of this. I had to look inside the storage room. Holding my breath, I opened the door. The storage room door creaked open slowly, and I stepped inside. My breath was shaky, the iron scent of blood still lingering in the air. But something had changed. The floor was clean, save for a few faint red stains. I began shifting stacks of cardboard boxes, moving freezers, searching for anything that might tell me the history of this place. Then, in the corner near the floor, hidden behind a pile of boxes, I spotted a small door. It was barely noticeable, pressed into the gray wall as if it had been forgotten for years. My fingers trembled as I reached for the metal handle. I had no idea what to expect, but a part of me already knew that the answer to all my questions lay beyond that door. It opened effortlessly, without a single creak. I stepped forward. A sterile white room. The light was bright, blindingly so, too clean for a place like this. Along the walls stood tables covered in tools, surgical knives, saws, scalpels. Some were freshly cleaned, others bore dark stains I didn't want to identify. The scent of antiseptic mingled with something spicier, familiar, yet utterly repulsive. I took another step and saw the list pinned to the wall. Inventory. Left hand, wrist, right foot, teeth, white, no cavities, hair, dark, long, 100 grams, eyes, blue, freshly harvested. My gaze drifted lower. Another list. This one made me stumble back, covering my mouth. Menu. Ice salad, blood pudding, fresh blood, grilled fingers, ears with caramelized onions, heart sautéed with herbs. My stomach lurched. I had no idea who the victims were or where the owner sourced his inventory, but one thing was clear: bodies and body parts were vanishing into those black packages. This was something far worse than I had ever imagined. I couldn't stay here any longer. I turned sharply and ran from the room, shoving the door so hard it slammed against the wall. I sprinted past the counter, not even glancing at the thick envelope of cash still sitting there. I didn't take my pay for this shift. Money didn't matter anymore. I burst into the parking lot and nearly collided with a dark figure. Grayson. The owner stood before me, his cold gaze locking onto mine. He didn't look surprised or angry. Just calm, too calm. "You've gone too far, Ethan." His voice was level, emotionless. I stepped back, but he didn't move. He just watched. Then, I turned and ran. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran until I reached my motel room, slamming the door shut and locking every bolt. I collapsed onto the bed, trying to steady my breathing. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. And then my phone vibrated. I slowly pulled it from my pocket. A message. Unknown number.
You know too much. You're next.
My fingers went numb. My gaze darted to the window, expecting to see a shadow lurking outside. But there was nothing. Only the silent, foggy dawn. I don't know what will happen to me next. But if you're reading this, don't make the same mistake I did. Never work at Hunter's Market. Friends, what do you think happened to the main character? Write your impressions of the story and whether you would like to hear more stories like this. Also, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, as it helps to promote it.